Monday, July 27, 2020. Pastor Ron Jetter, Immanuel Lutheran Church. Starting off a new week here. It's going to be 100 every day this week. I'm staying in, staying cool, and looking at Genesis. I've been looking at what's called the primordial prologue. These early chapters before we get into the story of Abraham and his covenant with God, God's covenant with him. Chapter 10 gives us a genealogy. And what do we get from genealogies? Well, as someone once said, just begat, 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 and who really cares? One person after another. So we've got it, for instance, chapter 10, verse 1. These are the descendants of Noah's son, Shem, Ham, and Japhet. And as we learned last time, Ham is the youngest, though always mentioned second. Children were born to them after the flood. The descendants of Japhet, and it goes on to say so on and so forth. And then it says, these are the descendants of Japhet in their lands, with their own language, by their families, in their nations. So what does that tell us? Well, it tells us that somehow as they spread out, they developed their own language. As George Bernard Shaw once said, England and America, two countries separated by a common language. Indeed, language changes when you move. There are regional dialects here in America. You can tell Canadians from Americans. You can tell Southerners from Westerners, from Northeasterners. And if you really know how to listen to dialect, you can listen to different regions even within England. England, Scotland, Ireland, Wales, they have numerous dialects, just as we do here in the United States. And so it was back then with the descendants of Japhet. Chapter 10, verse 4, the book of Genesis. Then it goes on, the descendants of Ham. Verse 15, Canaan became the father of Sidon and Heth, and the Jebusites, the Amorites, the Girgashites, the Hivites, the Archites, the Sinites, the Arvadites, the Zemarites, and the Hamathites. Afterwards, the families of the Canaanites spread abroad, and the territory of the Canaanites extended from Sidon in the direction of Gerar as far as Gaza, and in the direction of Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, and Zeboim as far as Lasha. These are the descendants of Ham by their families, their languages, their lands, and their nations. So it now tells us Canaan, who has been cursed because his father accidentally walked in on Grandpa Noah, who was inebriated. Poor Canaan and his descendants now inhabit what is modern-day Israel, a land God will give to Abraham. We already dealt with that last week, how it explains why the Israelites felt justified in conquering these people, because they were descendants of Cain. Canaan was cursed to become the father of a nation of people who were enslaved or driven out or slaughtered. Wow. But Shem was the oldest, and Shem was the one who would then receive favor. Verse 21, to Shem also the father of the children of Eber. Okay, Eber then is where we get the word Hebrew. So the descendants of Eber are the Hebrews. And the Hebrews then, when we follow the Hebrew line down, the Hebrews then become the ones from whom Abraham will emerge. The descendants of Shem, it goes on to say, all the various people. Eber is mentioned numerous times because, again, Eber is going to be the inheritor, and Eber's children and grandchildren, the inheritor of the covenant God makes with Abraham, a covenant that the Jewish people today still hold as fast and true. So that's what chapter 10 does. It deals with the families, and it says in there that they all had their families, their lands, their nations, and their languages. So they all had separate languages, which is curious because now we're going to get into chapter 11, which seems to have a different explanation for why people have different languages. And you know this story as the Tower of Babel. Now the whole earth had one language and the same words, and as they migrated from the east, they came upon a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. They said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly." And they had brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. And they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens. Let us make a name for ourselves, otherwise we will be scattered abroad upon the whole face of the earth." Well, it says as they went from east to west, they had one language. That directly seems to contradict what they just said in chapter 10. How is that? Well, one theory is that this primordial prologue is itself a compilation of different ancient traditions. There are some that want to explain how the Lord God Almighty, we would call God, the name of God, Yahweh. The Hebrews did not speak that name. It was too holy, so they would substitute Elohim Adonai or Adonai Eloheinu, depending, the Lord God Almighty, basically. And so it would be written in Hebrew, YHWH. Too holy to actually say. They didn't put vowels in there. You had to know what the vowels were. And of course, sometime in the 18th century, just 150 years ago, someone in our country said, well, but Y's and J's are interchangeable in Hebrew, and W's and V's. So instead of Yahweh, let's make it Jehovah. So Jehovah is a modern mistranslation of the ancient Yahweh. That's where we get the name of God being Jehovah. Same thing though, there were no vowels. You have to put the vowels in. Jehovah just adds one more vowel than Yahweh. But it said the people had one language. So who wrote this tradition? Well, again, there were those who wanted to maintain the priestly tradition. And they said, we're going to focus on any stories that have rituals in them, altars. Other people said, we're looking for stories that maintain the lineage of God's people. And somehow then when these were all compiled, they put the stories together. They weren't concerned that chapter 10 says people had different languages as they migrated versus chapter 11 that says they have one language even though they migrated, because they simply said these are the stories passed down to us. It's not the fact, it is the truth. And I think we can get really caught up in fact, and that's what biblical literasts do. They ignore contradiction in fact or explain it away. We are not biblical literasts. We are biblical truthists. We look for the deep truth about us and our relationship with the Lord God Almighty. We don't really care how the ancient people explain stuff. It's interesting, but we know that we have different explanations, modern explanations. We know the world's round. They didn't. Here, they said the earth had one language, and this story is intended to explain where different languages came from. Well, the Tower of Babel, if we go on, God didn't like the fact that they built a tower into heaven. Verse 8, chapter 11 of Genesis. So the Lord scattered them abroad from over the face of the earth. They left off building the city. It was called Babel because there the Lord confused the language of the earth, and there the Lord scattered them abroad. So chapter 10, a natural migration as they sought out new land to make their nations. Chapter 11, scattered because the Lord God didn't want them to have a common language. Let's go back to verse 6. Here's the explanation. The Lord said, they are one people. They will have one language. This is only the beginning of what they will do. Nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them. Now let's go and confuse their language so that they'll not understand one another's speech. So the confusing of languages is intended to keep them from compounding their sin. A common language is how you communicate, and what you communicate are evil ideas. Wow. So if we had one language, we would be much worse off. That's the thesis here. What do you think about that thesis? That's interesting. We had one common language. Everybody could understand each other. No English, Russian, French, Croatian, etc. No tribal languages in America, in Africa, or anywhere else. One language. We all understood each other. Would the world be worse off? That's the thesis. Food for thought. I don't have an answer to the question, but in spite of not having one language, we've still found ways of compounding our sin and complicating our lives. That was never more true than in the 1940s and 50s, when the Second World War propelled us into the atomic age. And boy, all of a sudden then, science is the way we're trying to keep the world safe through what we call mutually assured destruction, MAD, MAD, to make sure that if you push the button, we push the button, and nobody wins. Wow. We didn't even need one language to get to that point. And we've been back and forth where our whole lives have been lived with that reality. Nonetheless, we have this ancient story whose purpose is to say, here's why there's different languages. And then we have chapter 10 that says, here's why there's different languages. See you tomorrow.